Distribution of powers. The Kentucky Constitution divides governmental authority among the three branches of government as follows. Section 27. The powers of the government of the Commonwealth of Kentucky shall be divided into three distinct departments, and each of them be confined to a separate body of magistracy, to wit, those which are legislative, to one, those which are executive, to another, and those which are judicial, to another. Section 28. No person or collection of persons, being of one of those departments, shall exercise any power properly belonging to either of the others, except in the instances hereinafter expressly directed or permitted. These sections have been a part of Kentucky's Constitution since 1792. Except for minor revisions, these sections contain the language of the original provisions found in the first Constitution and reflect a strong commitment to the doctrine of separation of powers. The only changes in these sections have been the inclusion of the words Commonwealth of Kentucky and the use of the word judicial instead of judiciary in Section 27. The doctrine of separation of powers represented one of the most significant legacies of the American Revolution, whose leaders believed that liberty could best be achieved by dividing the powers of government and ensuring that no branch encroached upon another. One of the most zealous proponents of the doctrine, Thomas Jefferson, authored the original sections of the first Constitution at the request of Kentuckians. Although these sections seem to be quite clear, they have been the subject of heated debate and litigation through the years.
One or both of these sections have also been cited by the Kentucky judiciary to invalidate an attempt by the governor to adjourn the General Assembly in Taylor v. Beckham, 1900. The Kentucky Supreme Court has held that empowering the state Senate to confirm the gubernatorial appointments of judges dealing with workmen's compensation administrative law does not unconstitutionally encroach upon the powers of the executive, in Crouse v. Kentucky State Senate, 1994. It is also not a violation of Sections 27 and 28 for the legislature to delegate to a city council the power to extend the provisions of a statute establishing a city personnel commission to city departments not specifically mentioned in the legislation, in Kerr v. City of Louisville, 1937. Also, there were 4 recent cases that define the limitations of power of the governor and legislature and address the issue of separation and balance of power among the 3 branches of government. In the first case, ex parte auditor of public accounts in 1980, the auditor claimed the right to audit fees collected from State Bar Association members. The Supreme Court ruled that he had no right to audit these funds. The court included in its opinion a discussion of the constitutional and statutory duties of, and limitation upon, certain executive officers. The justices emphasized the authority of the legislature to empower the executive branch with authority not expressly or necessarily implied by the Constitution. The court specifically noted the constitutional provisions applicable to the legislature in establishing such duties, such as Section 91 that provides that the duties of the state auditor shall be established by the legislature. However, the General Assembly must not violate the constitutional principle of separation of powers, as established by Sections 27 and 28, by improperly assigning to the state auditor authority that is rightfully within the jurisdiction of the judicial branch. The court also specifically discussed the separation of powers and stated that the legislative branch has all authority not prohibited by the Constitution and not delegated to another branch. The discussion of the court relative to the limitations on the authority of the General Assembly and the duties of lesser executive elected officials may have encouraged action by Governor John Y. Brown Jr. that resulted in a suit brought against the governor by the Commissioner of Agriculture. Certain broad language of the court concerning legislative authority may have precipitated legislative action in the 1982 General Assembly that resulted in a friendly suit between the Legislative Research Commission and Governor Brown.
The second case, Brown v. Barkley, in 1982, concerned the authority of the governor to reorganize a department that was established by statute, but headed by a constitutional elected officer. The court held that when the General Assembly enacted a statute permitting the governor to reorganize executive agencies, it did not intend for the governor to reorganize departments headed by elected constitutional officers. A fundamental disagreement over the meaning of Sections 27 and 28 gave rise to the third case, one of the most significant decisions of the Kentucky Judiciary, Legislative Research Commission v. Brown in 1984. The case also involved a major effort by the 1982 General Assembly to capture governmental power at the expense of the governor. The current Constitution provided that regular sessions of the General Assembly should occur only once every 2 years and last only 60 days. These restrictions substantially weakened the Assembly, depriving it of the time needed to gather information necessary for informed lawmaking and, in many ways, putting it at the mercy of the governor, who had the time and resources needed to gather that information. In an effort to correct that imbalance and deficiency of power, the General Assembly in 1936 created the Legislative Research Council. The name was changed in 1948 to Legislative Research Commission, and authorized it to do research on pressing legislative matters during the interim between legislative sessions. Once composed of representatives of the executive branch, including the governor, and the legislature, in 1972 the membership of the commission became exclusively comprised of certain legislators.
The suit centered on the principle of separation of powers, as established by Sections 27 and 28 of the Constitution, and upon whether the Legislative Research Commission, consisting of legislative leaders, could exercise lawmaking power when the legislature was not meeting. Seeking to more substantially increase its powers versus the governor, in 1982 the General Assembly passed a series of statutes empowering the Legislative Research Commission to veto administrative regulations issued by the governor, to approve or disallow gubernatorial orders reorganizing the executive branch, and to nominate persons for gubernatorial appointment to certain executive agencies. The General Assembly also empowered the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate to appoint members of certain executive boards and agencies, appointed certain legislators to executive boards and agencies, and designated the Legislative Research Commission, traditionally thought of as only an agency of the legislature, as an independent agency of state government, thus making it exempt from the governor's control and reorganization. Specific issues included questions of whether certain legislative leaders could appoint members of executive agencies, whether the governor could be required to make certain appointments from a list provided by the legislature, whether LRC could be empowered to approve executive appointments, and whether legislators could serve on boards of executive agencies. The suit also addressed the authority of LRC to veto administrative regulations, to control certain budgeting matters, including budget specifications and restrictions, and to approve certain grant applications. Finally, the suit addressed the issue of a statute passed in 1982 that empowered LRC to approve reorganizations made by the governor.
The Kentucky Supreme Court invalidated most of this legislation, in part because it violated the separation of powers doctrine as embodied in Sections 27 and 28. The Supreme Court held that implementation of certain statutory action of the 1982 General Assembly would violate the constitutional principle of separation of powers. These statutes empowered LRC to act as the legislature when the legislature was not in session. The court also noted that a portion of the legislative membership, LRC, was attempting to act for the entire body. The court strictly interpreted the separation of powers clause of Sections 27 and 28 when it cited the constitutional limitation on the duration of legislative sessions and the requirement that the legislature consist of 2 chambers. Thus, any type of legislative action, whether undertaken by the full body or by the LRC on behalf of the General Assembly, was prohibited. More specifically, the court ruled that, in order to preserve the separation of powers, specific legislative leaders could not appoint members of executive agencies, the governor could not be required to make appointments from names submitted by certain members of the General Assembly, and legislators could not serve on boards of executive agencies. The court held that to permit LRC to approve executive appointments or reorganization orders, to veto administrative regulations, or to hold authority to reject certain grant applications would violate constitutional provisions relative to establishment of a bicameral legislature and the specified time during which the legislature may act.
The court did uphold a statute permitting the General Assembly to enact a spending reduction plan to respond to a drop in anticipated revenue of less than 5%. The governor must merely report to LRC all plans to modify the budget when anticipated revenue drops more than 5%. The court also permitted changes requiring that the executive budget be given to the General Assembly early in the session, but did not uphold the statute requiring that the budget be in the form of a resolution. The court held that the Constitution requires that the budget be in bill form. The last case involved the ability of the governor to spend state funds without a legislatively enacted budget. The General Assembly did not pass a state budget in 2002 or 2004, and the governor, in order to continue state services and programs, created an executive spending plan. The Kentucky Supreme Court held in Fletcher v. Commonwealth that the passage of a budget is a legislative function. Therefore, the governor could not expend funds absent a legislative budget, except for constitutionally, statutorily, or federally mandated budgetary expenditures. The case also clarified that, although Kentucky does not have a constitutional provision requiring a budget, if one is passed, it must be balanced, under sections 49, 50, and 171 of the Kentucky Constitution. Thank you for viewing this history of the Kentucky Constitution. For more information, please see the following references. Citizen's Guide to the Kentucky Constitution by the Legislative Research Commission, available online. Or the book The Kentucky State Constitution, by Robert M. Ireland, Oxford University Press.